But I go, can I just try another one? That moment comes and I just go, this is Sparta!
He screamed one line that echoed through pop culture for almost 2 decades. But behind that roar was a body breaking down, a set full of hospital runs, and a secret Gerard Butler kept quiet for years. What really happened on the set of 300 was far darker than anything audiences saw on screen, and now the truth is finally out. When 300 landed in theaters in March of 2007, almost nobody in Hollywood expected it to become the phenomenon it did. There was no massive marketing machine behind it, no A-list ensemble the way studios usually banked on, and no conventional historical drama structure. Instead, director Zack Snyder took Frank Miller's graphic novel and turned it into something audiences had never quite seen before, a hyper-stylized, blood-soaked, slow-motion fever dream loosely inspired by the Battle of Thermopylae. It was a gamble. And it paid off in a way almost nobody predicted. The film opened to a staggering debut weekend, pulling in tens of millions of dollars against a production budget that was, by studio blockbuster standards, relatively modest. By the time its theatrical run wrapped up, 300 had crossed well past $400 million worldwide, turning it into one of the most profitable films of that entire year. For a movie built almost entirely on green screen soundstages, using actors who weren't yet household names, that kind of return was almost unheard of. But the box office numbers only tell part of the story. What 300 actually did was ignite a cultural shift. Suddenly, the image of Gerard Butler as King Leonidas, all sculpted muscle, leather cape, and unrelenting fury, became the new gold standard for what a leading man's physique should look like. Gyms across the country began advertising Spartan workouts. Fitness magazines ran cover stories breaking down how the cast supposedly built their bodies in a matter of months. Personal trainers built entire client bases around promising to turn regular guys into modern-day Spartans. The film wasn't just influencing what people watched. It was influencing how people trained, how they thought about masculinity, and how they measured physical intensity. That ripple effect lasted years beyond the movie's theatrical release. What most people never fully grasped, though, is that the version of events fans saw on screen was a heavily polished illusion. Nearly everything about the production, from the environment the actors worked in, to the physical toll the shoot took on their bodies, was far rougher than the finished film let on. Gerard Butler has spoken about this in bits and pieces over the years, in interviews scattered across more than a decade, and when you put those comments together, a much more brutal picture starts to emerge. This wasn't a film where actors simply memorized lines and hit their marks. This was closer to a physical ordeal that pushed grown men to their absolute limits, day after day, for months on end. Let's start with the injuries, because according to Butler himself, they were a near-constant presence on set. In multiple interviews, he's described a filming environment where getting hurt wasn't the exception, it was practically expected. He's talked about turning around mid-scene to find a crew member being rushed off set after a mistimed hit, or another performer going down with a broken bone during a fight sequence. The choreography for 300 was designed to look brutal and immediate, which meant the margin for error was razor-thin. Even with blunted weapons and careful rehearsal, the sheer number of takes, combined with the physical demands of full-contact stunt work, meant that cuts, bruises, and worse became part of the daily routine rather than rare mishaps. Part of the reason injuries piled up the way they did comes down to how Snyder chose to shoot the action. Rather than leaning heavily on stunt doubles the way a lot of big-budget action films typically do, many of the actors were pushed to perform their own fight sequences. That decision gave the movie its raw, visceral energy, the sense that you were watching real bodies colliding rather than choreographed doubles standing in for the stars. But it also meant the cast was absorbing real physical punishment, over and over, take after take, in a controlled studio environment that offered very little room for recovery between setups. And that studio environment was brutal in its own right. Almost the entire film was shot on a soundstage, with the vast majority of the finished footage built around visual effects added later in post-production. That meant the actors spent most of their time surrounded by blue screens rather than actual sets, fighting enemies that existed only in their imagination and would be filled in digitally months later. The lighting setups needed to achieve that glowing, high-contrast look the film became known for generated intense heat on set. Combine that with heavy armor, prolonged physical exertion, and repeated takes, and you get a recipe for exhaustion. Butler has said that the heat and physical strain got so extreme during filming that he passed out at one point from a combination of dehydration and overexertion. That's not a detail that made it into any trailer or behind-the-scenes featurette at the time. It came out later, once Butler started opening up more candidly about what the production actually demanded of him. Before any of that filming even started, though, the real ordeal had already begun months earlier. To physically transform into Leonidas, Butler underwent an intense, months-long training program built around functional strength, conditioning, and combat movement. He trained for roughly 7 months leading up to production, with sessions that reportedly stretched for hours at a time. This wasn't a typical Hollywood body prep regimen built around isolated muscle groups and vanity lifts. It was closer to military-style conditioning, mixing heavy compound lifts, high-intensity circuit work, and simulated combat drills meant to build strength that would actually hold up under the physical demands of the shoot. The man behind that training was strength coach Mark Twight, whose approach was notoriously unforgiving. Twight didn't design a program meant to make actors look good in a mirror. He built a program meant to make them functionally strong and endurance-tested, capable of performing demanding physical sequences for hours without breaking down. The training blended elements of what would later be recognized as CrossFit-style circuit work with more traditional strength training, along with martial arts conditioning to prepare the cast for the specific movement patterns their fight choreography would require. Sessions reportedly included heavy lifting, sprint intervals, and full-body circuits designed to simulate the kind of exhaustion a soldier might feel mid-battle, not just physical fatigue, but the kind of full-system depletion that changes how a person moves and reacts. Butler has since admitted that this training nearly wrecked his body. He's spoken about developing tendinitis, dealing with hip issues, and tearing his rotator cuff during the process. At certain points, he said he could barely lift his arms above his head because of the accumulated strain. And the physical demands didn't stop once cameras started rolling. Because the cast needed to maintain a certain physique throughout the shoot, many of them kept training between setups, squeezing in additional workouts on set just to hold on to the muscle definition the film required. It became a cycle where the body never really got a chance to recover. Train intensely for months beforehand, then continue training throughout a physically grueling shoot with very little downtime in between. There's also a piece of this that rarely gets discussed, which is the mental and emotional side of what Butler put himself through. He's talked in interviews about trying to genuinely connect with the mindset of a man like Leonidas, someone who was, by the nature of the story, leading his men toward almost certain death. Butler has described using meditation as part of his preparation, trying to mentally step into a headspace that went beyond simply reciting dialogue. For him, playing the role wasn't just about physical transformation. It was about trying to understand, on some deeper level, what it would take for a person to lead others into a fight they knew they likely wouldn't survive. That kind of emotional immersion, combined with the physical toll of training and filming, created a production experience that was far more demanding than a typical action film shoot. None of this happened in isolation, either. Butler wasn't the only one going through it. The rest of the principal cast, including names like Lena Headey, David Wenham, Dominic West, and a young Michael Fassbender, went through significant portions of that same training regimen and endured many of the same physical demands on set. And according to Butler, that shared suffering ended up forging a real bond among the cast, one that arguably shows up on screen in how convincingly the Spartans come across as a unified brotherhood rather than a group of actors reciting lines. When you spend months training together, pushing your bodies past what feels sustainable, and then spend additional months filming intense, physically taxing sequences side by side, you tend to come out of that experience with a different kind of relationship than the average film set produces. Butler has described feeling like the cast had, in some sense, already been through a kind of battle together before they ever stepped in front of the cameras, and that shared history gave their on-screen dynamic an authenticity that would have been much harder to fake. It's also worth understanding just how much of what audiences saw was built after the fact, digitally. A huge percentage of the finished film relied on visual effects work completed long after the actors left set. That means much of what looks like blood, gore, and environmental detail in 300 wasn't something the cast reacted to in real time. There were no blood packs bursting on impact, no elaborate practical makeup effects triggering visible reactions. Instead, the actors had to imagine the carnage around them and perform accordingly, reacting to threats and violence that would only exist once editors and visual effects artists filled in the gaps months later. That's a much harder acting challenge than it might sound like. Performing genuine fear, adrenaline, or fury in reaction to something that isn't physically there requires a level of imaginative commitment that a lot of films don't ask of their casts, and by most accounts, this was a defining challenge of the entire shoot. Given everything the cast endured, It's not surprising that 300 ended up leaving such a visible mark on fitness culture. The training regimen the cast followed eventually got adapted and packaged for the public as what became widely known as the 300 workout, a brutal, high-volume circuit built around a specific number of total repetitions across a handful of demanding exercises. Gyms and trainers around the world picked it up and started offering versions of it to clients hoping to build a similarly dramatic physique. What most people attempting that workout didn't realize was that it represented just a fraction of what the actual cast went through. The real preparation stretched across months, involved professional oversight, and still resulted in serious injuries even under controlled, expert conditions. Butler himself has said that the toll it took on his body was severe enough that he didn't feel like training again in any serious way for a significant stretch of time after filming Wrapped. Beyond the physical story, 300 also became a genuine turning point for Butler's career, and it's worth putting that into context. Before this film, Butler had worked steadily but hadn't broken through as a major leading man. He'd had visible roles, including playing the title character in The Phantom of the Opera a few years earlier, along with parts in other studio films, but nothing had positioned him as a true box office draw. Leonidas changed that almost overnight. The physical intensity of the role, combined with a performance built on real conviction rather than just spectacle, turned Butler into one of the most recognizable new action stars in Hollywood. In the years that followed, he moved between genres with surprising range, taking on a romantic lead opposite Hilary Swank, transitioning into darker thriller territory, headlining action franchises built around his more rugged persona, and periodically stepping into comedic or emotionally driven projects that showed a different side of what he could do as a performer. None of that trajectory happens the same way without 300, and Butler has acknowledged as much over the years, describing the role as the project that fundamentally redefined what people expected from him as an actor. Looking back now, with the benefit of everything Butler has since revealed, it's clear that the making of 300 was a far more punishing experience than the polished final product ever suggested. Fans saw stylized violence, dramatic slow motion, and a now iconic roar of defiance against impossible odds. What they didn't see was the daily reality behind that footage, actors being taken to medical staff mid-shoot, months of body-breaking training that left long-term physical damage, extreme heat and exhaustion on a blue-screen soundstage, and a cast bonding through shared suffering in a way that arguably gave the film its emotional core. Butler has never framed any of this as a complaint. If anything, he's described it as the price of doing the role properly, of genuinely earning the character rather than simply performing him. But it does reframe how you might watch the film today, knowing that so much of what looks like effortless intensity on screen was actually the product of real pain, real risk, and real sacrifice behind the camera. There's something worth sitting with in that. Movies like 300 tend to get remembered for their visual style, their quotable lines, and their cultural footprint. Less attention usually goes to what it actually cost the people making them to pull it off convincingly. In this case, the gap between the spectacle on screen and the reality behind it turns out to be enormous. A film about warriors willing to sacrifice everything for a cause ended up being made by a cast that, in its own way, sacrificed quite a bit themselves, physically and mentally, to bring that story to life. Whether or not that changes how you feel about the movie, it's hard to watch King Leonidas roar his way through those battle sequences again without thinking about everything that actually went into making that roar believable. It's also worth stepping back and looking at how unusual 300's success actually was within the wider landscape of Hollywood filmmaking at the time. In the mid-2000s, big-budget action movies were still largely built around traditional set construction, location shooting, and recognizable movie stars carrying the marketing. 300 broke almost all of those conventions at once. It relied on a cast of actors who, aside from a handful of recognizable faces, were mostly unknown to mainstream audiences. It was shot almost entirely against blue screens in a studio in Montreal rather than on elaborate physical sets or historical locations. And its marketing leaned heavily into its visual style rather than star power. Studios at the time were understandably nervous about a project that broke so many established rules. When it became a genuine box office phenomenon, it didn't just make money, it proved a new model could work, one built around a singular visual identity and a director's specific creative vision rather than a conventional blockbuster formula. That proof of concept opened doors for a wave of stylized, effects-heavy films that came after it, many of which borrowed directly from the visual language Snyder established with 300.